D&D. If you have even the vaguest interest in the fantasy genre or even speculative fiction in general, you know what D&D is. It's probably one of the best things to ever happen to fantasy in terms of proliferating it across the public sphere, especially after it was showcased so well in media like Stranger Things. Assuming you can get a good group together, almost anyone can play it and have a good time. And yet, I'd argue it's having sort of a negative effect on fantasy as a genre of storytelling, and while it's not super hard to see, it's a little hard to articulate why. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. The ways in which the specific nature of settings made for tabletop RPGs, like D&D, are negatively affecting the writing when those settings are brought to linear stories, mostly books and short stories and such. I do have to make a disclaimer though. Everything you're about to hear is, and I shouldn't really have to say this, my opinion. I love D&D, and my critiques of its effects on writing have nothing to do with my opinion on that. While there are things that I'll discuss that I think are objectively bad, some of these are matters of taste, and if you disagree with me, that's okay. Anyway, one of the biggest ways that this effect has expressed itself, and perhaps the most relevant to the viewers of my channel, which is so often about world building, will be Part 1. Settings for tabletop RPGs, not novels. So very recently we did a big Q&A for the channel, and a wonderful viewer of mine, Saint Sir Nicholas, asked, will you make books based on your RPG setting? And in answering this question, I was provoked to a kind of interesting thought, because my setting is a novel setting I made an RPG out of, not an RPG I made a novel out of. And I realized that has a pretty distinct effect. My world was not created with the needs of a tabletop RPG first, but the needs of a novel, and thus, in practical terms, there are significant differences between my setting as a novel and as an RPG. So what's the big deal? Why does it matter what a world is used for first, and what do you do about it if you want to have both a novel and a RPG for your world? It would be very easy for me to say, well, start with the novel's needs and then make what you need for the tabletop RPG. Because that's kind of what I did, but it's not that simple. Plenty of people have likely developed their setting through running tabletop RPGs and didn't even know they wanted to do a novel until they were a good few months or years into thinking of their setting as a place for RPGs. And then, of course, I've run campaigns in part for the purpose of developing my world, even though the novel was always first and foremost. So instead, the problem here often comes when the writer doesn't recognize what needs to change between a novel world and a tabletop RPG world. This is especially true when the tabletop RPG that writer is coming from is specifically Dungeons and Dragons, which it almost always is, because D&D is so setting agnostic, why wouldn't you make your own setting out of it? However, you can see this effect the other way around if you interact with tabletop RPGs set in established verses, particularly the Warhammer ones, where you are suddenly burdened with all sorts of expectations of understanding the world as it is and maintaining its integrity in a way that just does not happen with D&D. It would be much more difficult to narratively justify getting the players to a point where they could kill off the God Emperor in a 40k Wrath and Glory campaign than it would be for them to assassinate an entire royal court in a more general D&D campaign. And that's because 40k is a verse in which the players, even be they Space Marines or whatever, are not capable of becoming the ultimate power or authority over the setting in the way that's possible with D&D. I mean, just see all the things level 20 characters can do. With established settings in tabletop RPGs come limitations, and that's harder to understand in the inverse, when you're moving from the RPG to the linear story. However, one of the biggest differences between a tabletop RPG and a novel setting is how they interact with the paradox of choice, which states that the more options one has, the harder it becomes to actually make a decision. Worlds that come from tabletop RPGs, first and foremost, are built to give prospective players as many choices as possible. From character species and classes to the whole, well, I've got these couple of side quests, maybe I could go gambling in a tavern until I lose all of my money, maybe I go explore the dungeon, oh what, you're telling me there's a main plot effect. This is great for tabletop RPGs, they should be this way. I mean, main plots are important, but a lot of the appeal is allowing the players to have agency. But that isn't how linear storytelling works, not really. A tabletop RPG is a buffet. There are lots of side dishes, and you'll get to the main dish eventually, but it's completely at your pace and in your order. A linear story is a mountain. There may be more than one way to get to the top, but ultimately you're either climbing or falling. In summary, in wanting to make a story out of a tabletop RPG system, or even to novelize a D&D campaign you've experienced, it's going to tend to create problems of a lack of plot focus. A good way to explain this might be such. Imagine the Kingdom Come Deliverance games were made into movies. Those games have an excellent story with world building, that is to say authentic attention to historical detail, which is very impressive. However, if the movie turned out like the game the way that people actually play it, that's to say, main plot happens for a while, and then because Henry decides he's a completionist, he spends the middle half of the movie doing completely unrelated side quests, and then speedruns the actual plot at the end, it would be a very bad movie, even despite the fact that all of the characters and the scenes in it would be good. The plot would lack focus. Interactive experiences are not paced the way that linear ones are, and where books can make more time than games for things like the everyday life of the protagonist or truly complex character relationships. I mean, even in the most character-heavy of games, dialogue is limited by the developers knowing players are only patient enough for so much of it. And then there's this experience, which anybody who's played RPG games has experienced some variant of. Games instead focus on experientially deep stories. That is to say, instead of extra scenes of people talking, there are more likely to be extra scenes of exploring lost dungeons or things like that. In a linear experience, everything serves the main plot, even if not directly. In games, including tabletop RPGs, sheer gameplay can justify something existing by itself in a way that obviously doesn't apply to a story in which you are not playing it. So to loop this all around back to the practical effects, this means that I've seen in a lot of world-building plots or what have you from prospective fantasy writers that they will often just make things and add them. Excess world building in general is definitely something you see a lot. Now, it should be noted that continuing to world build stuff for your universe isn't bad so long as you don't cram it into places where you don't need it, and that it doesn't distract you from actually getting plot done. But when it isn't done right, it often turns into having these sort of side quest scenes without the character development or other sorts of plot gains that can be made from that sort of thing. However, this whole concept of TTRPG bound settings just keeps giving, as the next concept here really deserved a section of its own, and that is Part 2, Prepackaged Characters and Concepts. So a few months ago, I was sitting in a workshop with some writers who hadn't met one another until that day. We'll call the first one Sam and the second one Mary. They were talking about a world-building concept that had to do with this town built in a wasteland. Both were working on settings for novels, so, they were exchanging ideas. Sam said something like, "This town is pretty isolated, so it has a hard time defending itself." And Mary said something like, "Ah, I bet the orcs are a constant threat." And Sam responded, "Yeah, they are." I'll give you a second to think about why this exchange is notable. Alright, when exactly did Mary learn there were orcs in Sam's world? They'd never even met each other before now. It's not like Mary could have known that in any other way than by assuming, by default, that this fantasy universe would inherently have orcs. And not only did Sam agree, he didn't even make notes of her knowing that already. I mean, sure, orcs are fantasy staples, don't get me wrong, but they aren't a requirement for something to be fantasy. So what this whole Part 2 is about is the fact that D&D has neatly packaged up every single fantasy concept and put them in one grand mythical shelf at the story supermarket. It has its upsides. Now there's a sort of common agreement on what's an elf and what's a goblin or a troll and so on, which is useful, as that has actually not at all traditionally been the case throughout history. I mean, look at all the different kinds of mythological beings that all get called elves. There are a lot. The downside is that now these creatures become sort of factory produced. Each product identical every time. Pick up the new Beholder Bites today. Good for any occasion. Even should one combine ingredients differently, you can still tell when it's Wizards of the Coast brand products, and maybe it's just me, but after the Pinkerton thing, I don't like buying from that brand all that much. I know I'm being a little facetious about this, really, but I kind of find that the way D&D just even categorizes concepts has really seeped into storytelling and world-building circles. I was once in a workshop in which a person introduced their characters in the written narrative as the half-orc bard, the gnome druid, and the human fighter. These are not universal concepts. These aren't even job titles, save maybe the bard. If you're going to dictate character archetypes by class, at least do it from a tabletop RPG system that has classes that dictate what the character actually does with most of their time. If you call someone a knight or an artist or an herbalist, at least then I actually know what their job is. But like, what is a fighter? That can be anything from a gladiator to a mercenary to a bodyguard. Once again, it's great for D&D. No problem with this in D&D. It allows all sorts of flexibility in creating a character. But what it isn't is the basis for creating a character in a narrative. And even if it must be directly stated that this character is a human or an elf or whatever you might have, the need to phrase it as character, species, class makes it feel like you might as well just throw a level 5 onto the front of that description. At that rate, just write a completely self-aware story that just admits that it's D&D. You could actually probably do something with that concept. My point here is just that there is so much potential for variation in fantasy settings, and when people just take stock ideas out of D&D, it just kind of makes me a little sad. And it's a little rough, too, in the sense that if you are running stock D&D and want to make a novel out of it, you're going to have to make substantial changes to separate your world from that of stock D&D. It can definitely be done, but it is an extra layer of work to do. After that, however, comes one of the most troublesome aspects of this whole conversation, which is part 3, D&D is fundamentally anti-narrative. I would have called this D&D is fundamentally anti-linear cohesive narrative, but it is too long of a title to just call it that. In either case, take the following 2 examples. Example 1, take Star Wars. Luke, Han, Chewbacca, and Obi-Wan land on the Death Star. As we're used to, Luke and Han disguise as stormtroopers so they can rescue Leia while Obi-Wan goes to find a way for them to escape. Then in the prison compartment, Luke Skywalker takes a crit from a stormtrooper and nat 1s his death saves. Luke Skywalker is freaking dead. Han then goes up to Leia but fails the charisma check to get her to follow him because he too rolled a nat 1. He then jumps down the garbage compactor and fails the investigation check to find the bar to prop it open and gets squished. Meanwhile, Obi-Wan fails an athletics check to get onto that platform with the shield generator and plummets to his death. Chewbacca is still alive, but what exactly is he going to do now? Credits roll. Alright, that's pretty far. Example 2, Lord of the Rings. Frodo and Sam are trudging through the dead marshes, but then Frodo slips on a banana peel and falls into the water. Sam fails to rescue him and Frodo drowns. A few minutes later, a new hobbit named Drobo Saggins walks up, fishes the One Ring out of the water, and the two carry on towards Mount Doom. In a D&D game, these really aren't huge problems. I mean, the first is definitely a problem, but that's just the way the game works. In a narrative, I feel like I should not have to say it. And while these are ridiculously exaggerated examples, nobody is actually writing like this. I made them to emphasize the point that sometimes the sort of random dice rolly wackiness of tabletop RPGs can slip into linear storytelling in ways that just do not work. Stories are not dependent on the roll of a single die. They're needed in games because that's what makes them games, but that doesn't work in narratives. Things happen for reasons. They happen because of foreshadowing, because of character motivations, because of the demands of the plot, not because an icosahedron told it to. None of this is to say things that are still unexpected to the audience shouldn't happen, but from the author's point of view, there's going to still be more to it than just a die. While one translating a D&D setting into a novel might not have this problem so much, one translating a D&D campaign into a novel very likely will, unless every roll went the narratively appropriate way every single time, which I guess at that point would be incredible enough you should write a novel about it, but I digress. And then again, anyone can experience this problem if D&D becomes one's litmus test for storytelling, which it very well can. People can get very D&D brained, and suddenly the decisions made for an interactive game start to seem right for a narrative, and you get this problem. Also, last thing here, AI writing does this sort of insert random event here thing a lot. Don't use it for creative writing. It's for your own good, among other reasons to not do it. The previous 3 problems of the previous 3 parts are all solvable, however, if the writer heeds part 4, Separate the worlds. I'm making a declaration for you right now. I'm dictating it even as the BBEG of your writing life in this current moment. Your tabletop RPG setting and your novel setting are not the same. That's it. That is now true. Now that I've done you this immense favor, let me explain why that's the case and what the hell I'm even talking about anymore. The things that matter about your world for an RPG are not the things that matter for your world in a novel, as I hope has become clear already. Things are not balanced the same way. Magic will not be identical because, Lord please, I do not want to hear someone try to describe spell slots in a written narrative. But to put myself on the firing line, I'll explain with my own setting. The world of my tabletop RPG spans 3 completely different fleshed-out continents as of this moment, replete with dozens of cultures, several different pantheons and magic systems, and adventurers from all over the world are common. In the world of my novel, most of the plot of the first part takes place in one building complex. There are only humans from 4 cultures with 1 pantheon and 1 magic system that they're studying, and when some traveling merchants from a far-off land come around one day, and they have a pleasant exchange, that is considered a notable amount of exposure to the outside world.
But J-Bat, the novel version sounds boring,
you might say. You're allowed to think that, especially when I present it this way on purpose. But do you know what else the novel has? In-depth characters with complex lives and a growing deep understanding of the religion they're a part of, the culture they inhabit, and the magical blessings that set them apart from others. Then, of course, a minor thing, a footnote really, a coherent plot. And all of this I say just because no matter how cool all of your world building is, if the world of the novel had all of the stuff in it that the world of the tabletop RPG had, would not matter how cool that stuff is, nobody wants to read 100 pages of me describing it. And you might also say,
but J-Bat, these really aren't the same world at all anymore. Why are you even comparing them?
And that is where this theoretical straw man would be incorrect. These are the same worlds, but the priorities are different. The novel concerns 3 people who live in that world. There is no player who knows everything that's going on, who makes meta-level decisions for these characters while a game master watches over them. These are people who only know what they know about the world. There might be whole civilizations across the ocean, but they aren't aware of that, because the novel doesn't need them to be. Tabletop RPGs are necessarily broad, much like I said at the beginning. You need to know something about everything in a world to run a tabletop RPG. With a novel, you don't need something about everything, you need everything about some things. In summary, the big difference is that the focus is narrowed with the novel. You can't make meta decisions for your characters based on your knowledge as the universe's creator. You're truly acting as the character, and generally speaking, that character is not going to be calling people high elf paladins or referring to being out of 3rd level spell slots and needing a long rest to recover them. Unless, of course, you're doing it that way, knowledgeably and on purpose. However, more than any of this, and as I alluded to earlier on, the worst offender of any of this is Part 5, Identity Crisis. None of the settings any of us are writing are entirely unique. We're all building off of something, be it Tolkien, real history, myths of different cultures, or be it a mishmash of any of those things. None of our creations are 100% bespoke. As I say all the time, there's nothing new under the sun. But what they can be is 100% you. When I was talking about that person who wrote about the half-orc bard and the gnome druid, I'm not upset about that because they were dumb for talking about D&D classes, though obviously it would be an improvement if that way of describing them wasn't there. What I was upset about is that I can't remember a single thing about their story or world otherwise. It really wasn't even that long ago either. The others in that workshop who weren't writing fantasy, I remember their stories. One was about a guy who took care of the Statue of Liberty who, lacking friends, almost befriended the old monument. I remember that story. It had an identity. Also, if you're the person who wrote that and found this video somehow, hey, I hope you're doing well. But for the first person, though they didn't realize it, fantasy was working against them as a writer. It was making their work bland. It was making it uninspired because this person's story was so wrapped up in the D&D-ification of the genre. I mean, come on, this is fantasy. The genre about making up worlds nobody's ever dreamed of. And yet, somehow, through this effect, I dare say the average fantasy story has become less inventive than ever before. And while at its peak, I love this genre more than any other, at its current state, I'd almost rather read anything else than something afflicted by this curse. So, that, I guess, is D&D-ification of fantasy. Now, it is obviously worth noting, once again at the end of this is all my opinion, and really, a lot of what I'm talking about here are the mistakes of amateur writers. These are the sort of things that someone properly experienced is probably just not going to do. But I feel like it's a type of issue that is afflicting people writing the genre nowadays a lot, especially new people, and it is making their journey of improvement harder than it really needs to be. So hopefully this has brought some amount of awareness or some thoughts about this issue, but I hope you enjoyed the video. I felt a little negative in this one, and I don't really like doing that, but I feel like this is an important topic. If you have any thoughts of your own about this issue, I read every comment and would love to see them. In addition, every like and subscription go a long way since we're still small here, though the channel has been doing really well recently, so I may not be saying anything like that soon, depending on what happens. We also have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want that for some reason, where we post all of our videos a week early. On that note, I would love to thank our patrons, Shadowrunner and Sani, our Knights of the Inner Circle, Nico, our Knight, and Greer, our loyal squire. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and remember, when it comes to D&D and novels, as the Ghostbusters said, don't cross the streams.